You're listening to Dignity and Joy, a podcast from FoodShare. On the pod, we confront the systems of oppression that impact who has access to food and the land it's grown on, and who doesn't. Achieving something better will take hard work from all of us, and can only be done if we listen closely to the people who are already leading change in the way we think about food. In this three-part series, FoodShare's Sheldomar Elliott delves into the connections between food and justice with folks who have their fingers on the pulse and their hands in the soil. Together, they dream in color and consider what it would take to build a just and hopeful city. A city where everyone can feed themselves, their loved ones, and their community with dignity and with joy.
Hi, I'm Sheldomar Elliott, and welcome to this episode of Dignity and Joy, a podcast from FoodShare. Today our guest is Jaelyn Jarrett. Jaelyn is Afro-Indigenous and grew up in Nain, Nunatsiavut, a small Inuit community with her grandparents. When she was 9 years old, she relocated to Toronto to live with her Guyanese side of her family, and later to Ottawa, where she received her double honors degree in law and Indigenous studies. Today, she lives in Ottawa with her 11-month son, Kari, and works as a manager for Canadian Roots Exchange, a consultant for her own business. Welcome, Jaelyn.
Welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today, and I imagine that we have a lot to talk about, and I look forward to asking you about it all. But before we get into it all, I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm currently here in Toronto, sacred land that is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that this is territory covered by the dish with one spoon, wampum belt covenants. And at FoodShare, we think it's important to start any conversation on this land by recognizing the many nations of Indigenous peoples who presently live on this land, those who have spent time here, and the ancestors who have hunted and gathered on this land. I also want to acknowledge the many people of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced as part of the transatlantic slave trade, brought against their will, and made to work on these lands. At FoodShare, we believe advancing Indigenous solidarity is deeply and inextricably linked to Black liberation, and we remain committed to advancing both. So I just want to pause here, Jaelyn, and pass it to you to perhaps acknowledge where you're situated.
So I'm currently in the traditional unceded, uncertain territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, which is also considered Ottawa. I guess I'm a guest here, and I've been here for about 6 years now. I love it here. It's an honor to be able to be here and to live here, and to experience everything that it has to offer. I actually live in a community in Ottawa with they have like a nickname for it, which basically means in Inuk that this is where all the Inuit live. So I live in like a hub for Indigenous peoples and people of color in Ottawa, which is really amazing.
That's really beautiful, and I can imagine that's powerful. I imagine we'll also be touching on that. But, before we jump into this conversation, I really do want this to be relatively easygoing and informal, to say the least, but also I'm sure there'll be drops of knowledge here and there.
Yeah, for sure.
If it's all right with you, can we jump into maybe some icebreakers to kind of, get some things going and, yeah, let's keep it easy?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So, of course, they're going to be food related because what else would they be related to?
Yeah.
But I'll start with a quick one first. So, of course, what is your favorite food, Jaelyn?
Okay. Honestly, this is a really easy question. I actually have two. So my first is chicken and rice. And I say
Mm,
chicken and rice because I feel like every culture has a rendition of chicken and rice. So there's so many different ways to make it. Like my family is Guyanese, for example. So we will do like, chicken curry. I really like Indian food too. So
mm,
butter chicken and rice. Like I feel like it's so versatile.
very.
And then
Very.
my second favorite food would just have to be probably my traditional Inuit food.
Mm,
We'll get into that a little bit later, but like some of the things I like are like mattak, which is like whale blubber, or like tuktu, which is like caribou meat. So yeah, those are my two favorites.
awesome. That sounds great. Of course, I got to hear the other side of this, which is what is your least favorite food?
My least favorite food. I don't like vegetables.
Mm.
I'm honestly not a fan because when I was up north and I grew up north, we didn't have, I mean, vegetables are so expensive, right? So I didn't have a
Mm,
lot of like fresh vegetables and fresh food growing up. Actually, one of my other favorite foods is strawberries. And they're strawberries because in my community, strawberries were like $10, $15. So my
Jeez.
Anansiak would never hardly wanted to buy them for me. So that and strawberries and raspberries, love them.
I love that.
Not a fan of vegetables, but I'll eat them because I have to.
Of course. Yeah, and I guess to continue favorite foods, how about your favorite condiment? What would that be?
Oh my gosh.
Mm.
That's a good question.
It's it's a bit more deep.
Um, I don't I don't know. I don't really I feel like I cook with such flavorful like spices and, you know, I don't really use a lot of condiments like that. I feel like if you season your food properly, you don't really need condiments. Like I hate when people like you'll make a nice dish and people put ketchup on stuff all the time.
Yeah.
Ugh, I hate that.
I feel that. I mean, yeah, I'm not out here to yuck anyone's yum, but I feel strange sometimes with condiments where they don't need to be.
Yeah.
So that's real. Yeah, that's really real. Well, I'm glad that we're able to get some icebreakers out, and people now know if they want to give you food, that chicken and rice is the way to go.
Period.
But maybe just to jump into some of your backstory and your journey to where you are now. I know you said that you grew up with your grandparents. Do you want to maybe share a little bit about your upbringing and everything around that?
For sure. So I was actually born in Ottawa. Ottawa is a huge hub, like I said, for Inuit. A lot of Inuit from Inuit Nunagat, which means like the place where Inuit live, so the four regions, Nunatsiavut, Nunavik, Nunavut, Inuvialuit, especially people from Nunavut. I guess I'm from Nunatsiavut. They come to Ottawa because it's a good place for education, job opportunities. Some people come down here for medical. There are a lot of Inuit here, and there's a lot of mixed Inuit here. So my Anansiak, she came down here for to pursue education at Carleton University, and she was also working with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. So RCAP is what we know, what a lot of people call it.
Mm.
And so she brought my mom here. Yeah, I was born here in Ottawa, and then my Anansiak went back up north. And then when I was not even 1 years old, my mom, we grew up with a lot of poverty and a lot of issues. So she decided to send me to live with my Anansiak. So yeah, she sent me up north, and my Anansiak and my Adatsiak were really all I knew. I remember actually I hadn't actually officially like met my mom from what I could remember until I think she came to see me when I was like 3 years old.
Mm.
So my Anansiak and my Adatsiak, which are my grandparents, have had a huge impact on who I am and my life. On my maternal side, they're Inuk. So I grew up, and when I say up north, I'm referring to the community I grew up in, which is Nain, Nunatsiavut, which is one of the four regions of Inuit Nunagat, also known as Labrador, Northern Labrador, the most northerly community in Labrador.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I grew up there with them. I had an amazing childhood. Every spring, they would take me to our cabin, and I guess we lived pretty traditionally. Like my grandfather, and my grandmother, we would hunt, and then we would eat the food, and that's really what we lived off of. There was nothing else around us, really. And I lived with them until I was 9 years old. And then when I was nine, I was sent to go live with my other side of my family in Toronto, who I had never met them before. It was just completely different, and it was a huge culture shock for me. I remember coming to Ontario. I lived with my aunt in Toronto, but I remember coming to Ontario for the first time and seeing like I used to call them skyscrapers.
Mm.
So like just apartment buildings and stuff that I was just so fascinated by. I remember like my first time going on like a huge elevator, my first time going on a huge escalator. Like it was a culture shock for me. And so yeah, I lived there with my aunt and my grandparents who are Guyanese until I was 18. So like my most informative years. And I grew up actually right outside Toronto in Ajax. And it was really hard for me because I am visibly what I guess everybody in Toronto would call light skin,
Mm.
right? So I just passed as being mixed. But
Mm-hmm.
people didn't realize like I had come from a small Inuk community up north, and I had cultural needs that needed to be met. But because I was mixed and a lot of people just saw me as like she's black and white, nobody even really took notice to that or tried to, you know, nurture the culture that I had come from. And
Mm,
so I grew up in Toronto with like a huge identity crisis. Actually, a lot of people thought I was Asian and black because
mm,
Inuit can look kind of Asian, so a lot of people thought I was Blasian, and I'm not.
mm,
And when people would ask me my background, because I get that question all the time, I would just say, I'm Native. I would really dumb it down for people because that's just what was easiest for me. And as a kid growing up, nobody wants, I was just tired of over explaining myself to adults, especially. It's
mm,
exhausting.
mm,
So I think after a while, I also was starting to become ashamed. I remember I didn't want to call my grandmother. I was just embarrassed almost. I would tell people of my experiences up north, and people were just so ignorant, especially, how like kids are and teenagers are. People are so ignorant. They would make fun of me. I was just completely shamed. And so I stopped speaking Inuktitut.
mm,
And I would kind of speak like broken Inuktitut. So I wasn't fluent, but I grew up with it. So I could understand and I could conversate in like, the very basic ways, but I lost all of that. And then I think when I was 16, 17 years old, I was like, I want to get out of Toronto. Like I don't want to be here anymore because there's no Inuit here and I miss that. Like I miss that feeling of being around Inuit and feeling, accepted. And so I decided I'm going to go to Ottawa for university. So I went to
mm,
Carleton. And coming here was much easier than living in Toronto just because, like I said, Ottawa is a huge hub for Inuit, right? So, for instance, right next door, we have the Ottawa Inuit Clinic called Akasavik. Right up the street, we have a children's center that I actually went to when I was really small called Inuk. And so, when I would go into the Inuit community, there were a lot of members who were like, "Oh my gosh, Jaelyn, like, I haven't seen you since you were such a small baby." And, it was just like a feeling of belonging that I really needed. And so I stayed here. I graduated. Actually, when the pandemic hit, I went back to Toronto for a little bit. And then I ended up getting pregnant. And then I came back to Ottawa and I stayed here and I had my son. So that's just a little bit, yeah, a little bit of background of how I ended up here and how I got here
yeah.
and where I come from.
Thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, that's a lot there, and I really resonate with what you're sharing around sort of like trying to understand mixed race identity, and I can't say that I fully understand you because your experience sounds unique, but as a mixed race black man myself, it is a weird thing to try to figure out your place in the world and where you
Hmm.
fit, and society sees you one way and you know that you're not necessarily exactly what they think you are, or try to place you in a box. And I know for me it was art and music specifically that was able to keep me feeling connected to my Jamaican side, and then food to my Portuguese side. And I know I was reading an article you wrote for the Inuit Art Quarterly, and I was sort of struck by how you spoke about rarely seeing yourself represented in art and how that creates a sort of distance from it. And I think you just spoke to this now, but there is so much power, it seems, from you being able to see your identities reflected in an exhibit by the artist Catherine Takpani,
Yeah.
and it seems really powerful. Can you speak to that, and what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so I was actually in an English class. It was a fourth year English class, and as part of it, we had to go to this museum. And I'm gonna be honest, like or it was an art gallery, and I'm not always the biggest fan of art galleries, just because I find them to be sometimes very like colonial and just completely. I can't relate. I'm completely disconnected from what they have on display. But this one, I was actually really surprised about it. It was as soon as I walked in, I saw it was curated by Cozy Nebe, and sorry, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, so just don't quote me on that.
It's all right.
And so I remember walking in, kind of walking around, and my English professor was like, "Jaelyn, are you okay? You're really quiet." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm just observing." And so I was walking around, and one of the pieces that stood out to me was Catherine's piece because I noticed both of my cultures in one artwork in one display, and I've never seen that before. It's
Mm,
either I'm Inuk or I'm black in Guyanese. I've never seen them amalgamated in one piece of art in any book anywhere really. And so I just kept staring at it and I was like, this is so interesting. And it came from, I guess, a gathering that had taken place in Ottawa, and somebody had brought a bottle of sorrel. And
Mm,
if you're West Indian, you already know, like, yeah,
already
what,
know.
it's just like Christmas time. Like, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of sorrel, first of all, is the smell of my grandmother making it. And then just like the festive Christmas time and, feeling so much comfort. And then I also saw that they had country food and kulik, which is like an Inuit lamp that you light. And so we had been taken around through the exhibit, and the person who was giving us a tour said, does anybody want to comment on this? And usually I'm very quiet in these types of scenarios, but everybody was pretty quiet, and I was just like, yo, like I have to say something. Like I've never been in a situation before.
It's a must.
I basically was just like, yeah, like this is what we're seeing right now, and this is like the significance of it, and this is why food is important, and this is how it brings people together. And then I was really like vocal in that moment. I was really confident, and I think that's the first time I've been able to really, I guess, take up space in that type of way when it comes to art, when
Mm,
it comes to any form of like an exhibit. And so that was like really powerful. And later on, the person who was giving us a tour came and talked to me. She was really nice, and then we ended up connecting. And then I did some work for them. And then Inuit Art Quarterly, they ended up reaching out to me, asked me to write that article. So yeah, it was powerful. And I think there needs to be more of that. Like I would love to see Inuit art and like the Inuit women represented in art with like curly hair, and
mm-hmm.
I feel like it's so important, and it's like I said in my article, it's not just important for me, it's important for the younger generations. I live in Vanier in Ottawa, and there are so many Black and Indigenous kids running around here. Like I see them all the time. And I always think
Yeah.
to my experience when I was younger, I never saw myself. I never saw anybody who looked like me. So for me, it was like, how am I supposed to visualize myself in certain spaces when there's no representation of myself? And some people may say, well, your indigenous side, your Inuk side is represented, or your black side is represented, but it's not the same. It's not the same as seeing me as a whole person because my identities aren't separate, right?
Mm, mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was really powerful. And Catherine Takpani, she is an amazing photographer, and I'm really hoping to be able to see more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Art just has that effect on people, right? It really can imagine the future. It could be revolutionary. It represents so much that we don't see, and yeah, that really sits with me. So thank you for sharing that. There's something else you wrote in that piece that reflects a lot of the questions that we're often thinking about at FoodShare, and we've even, reflected it in our land acknowledgement, where you wrote, "What does it mean to understand Indigenous people and people of African descent as Indigenous to their own lands and displaced from it in very different ways? And what are the ways in which we can hold space together?" And personally, that is something that I'm constantly thinking about, and it's something I don't have the answer to. I think it's a really sort of complex thing that may require time for Black and Indigenous communities to come together to see what that looks like. But I'm curious from you and sort of what you were just speaking to before about where you're living. What are the ways in which we can hold space together? And where do you see folks coming together to build these relations? And before you go ahead with that, I know that you work at Canadian Exchange, CRE, correct? The Canadian Roots Exchange?
Yeah.
So maybe you can even touch on some of the work you do there, but yeah, what does that look like for you in holding space with each other?
So I think in order to hold space between Black and Indigenous communities, in order for it to happen, I think that we need to really rethink history and rethink how we see the relations between each other. I think there's this understanding that Black and Indigenous people are only just now coming together, or they're only just now having conversations, they're only just now acknowledging each other. And I think that's so completely false. There's a long history, a long, long history in Canada of relations in North America, between Black and Indigenous people. And for instance, even when I tell people that I'm Inuk and Black, it's like, really? Wow, that's so amazing. And I'm like, is it though? Like, would you say that to somebody
Mm,
who was Inuk and white, or somebody who's Black and white? Probably not.
hmm
But we didn't, like, like indigenous people and black people didn't just start come together and start having kids. Like there's a history. I was actually looking through some archives recently, and I it was at a residential school, and I saw a kid who was clearly like Afro-Indigenous at that residential
Mm,
school. I've actually been told stories from elders about black people coming up north, and this is like a long time ago. This isn't anything recent, and so for instance, the the name in Inuktitut for black person, or a lot of people say, is Puatigi. And I asked my
mm,
Anansi, like, why do people call me that? And she started laughing, and she's like, Inuit are so funny. That means Portuguese. And I'm like, I was like, Portuguese. And then we got to talking, and she told me that she heard stories of whalers going up north and bringing black Portuguese people with them. And that's where that name came from,
mm.
or that's what she suspects at least. So there's a lot. Just because we're not written down in history, the relations between us doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There's lots of oral storytelling. I think that because we're so, I guess, just used to having to go to like history books and do research in a very, academic way, we don't look to like hear stories, and we don't look for those traditional ways of understanding, our like of histories between black and indigenous people. So I think that would be the first step. I think the second step is just really coming together and having conversations. A perfect example is through gatherings with food. Food, I think
Yes.
food is a great foundation for having these conversations for Inuit and for black people. I just think about how integral food is to both of my cultures, and
Mm,
we don't even realize how food holds space, not just as as individual cultures, but together. When I think of memories, when I think of some of my most fondest memories, food is the first thing that comes up. So I really think just like having conversations, having gatherings, having programs for our youth, having some of these conversations are also really hard to have. And so creating safe spaces where we can come together and have these conversations, and unpack some of the things that have gone on between our communities because of colonization, and like what that looks like. So
yeah. No, absolutely. I think those are all super strong recommendations, and I I imagine that youth should also be at the center of that. As you know, as cliche as it sounds, like youth are the future, and
absolutely.
there's so much. I actually, I think over the past few years, we've really seen youth lead a lot of these movements and momentum for change, and I think that would be really incredible. But I kind of just want to loop back on what you were talking about, food, and I would love to kind of explore that a little bit. Like, what are some of those earlier memories you have with food, either with your grandparents or perhaps even like in between both of your families? Like, what are some of those experiences, if you don't mind sharing?
That's a great question. So, Inuit, we call the English word for our traditional food, we call it country food. So, it's country food is just the term that we use, yeah, to describe Inuit food. So, it plays such an integral role in Inuit life, not just by producing like nutrition, but also it acts as like almost like a spiritual connection to land and to family. And unfortunately, environmental and social economic changes have kind of threatened food security, and it's made it really difficult to
Mm,
harvest. And on top of this, I live in the South, so the access to it is even more difficult. But when I think of some of my earliest memories, as soon as soon as I eat country food, I it's like a nostalgia. Country food
mm,
and our traditional food, it really brings like a sense of nostalgia. Like when I take a bite of matak, which is whale blubber, or niku, which is like dried caribou, or tuktuk, which is like frozen caribou. Like I said, it's just straight nostalgia. It's really special because it connects me to a lot of the memories that I have, especially of my Adatsiak who passed away.
mm,
Like I just think about even the smell of it, I just think about when we would go out to our cabin, and him and my Anansiak would go hunting together, and then he would, harvest the food, and we would eat it right there. Like it
mm,
it's just really I think it connects you to the land so much because there's no in between. It's just you harvest the food, you eat it. All those the you're connected to the food, you know where it comes from, so therefore you're connected to the land. I feel like we don't, when you go into grocery stores, we don't even think about where our food comes from. We don't even think about how like sacred food is, or we don't think about the animal, we don't think about where it's been, we don't think about really even what we're putting into our bodies.
Mm,
And so when I think about food, it's just like those, it's just so important. So because of environmental factors now, for example, in my community, they don't get caribou anymore. They don't get tuktu anymore. And so I'm so thankful that I was privileged enough to grow up with that. My Anansiak actually shared a picture on Facebook, I think last week, and it was a herd of caribou running past our house. And I think, in 2000, 1999, that was normal. You don't see, like, that's not a thing anymore. That doesn't exist. And so
mhm,
now our youth, people who are, I don't know, 10, 15 years younger than me, haven't even tried caribou. They haven't even tried tuktu before. So it's like, what does that mean, and how does that look in terms of their disconnection to land and therefore culture? What does that look in terms of their disconnection to, like, ancestors and grandparents, and sharing that? When also think of eating country food, I think of, my Adatsiak harvesting it and cutting it up so that we could share it with other people. There's so much like that goes into that. Like, that's sharing, and being generous is like a huge Inuit value. And so that's also learned through food.
mm,
Also, I think of sitting down, how we eat our country food for the most part. From me growing up, we would put like a cardboard box down, and my Inansik would sit there with her ulu, which is like a, I guess, traditional Inuit knife, and she would, chop up the meat, and then me and my siblings would just sit there and wait for like the wait for the meat, and we would talk to each other and laugh, and so it really creates like it connects family as well. So what happens when that goes away? I don't know what that looks. Actually, I do know what that looks like because I moved to the south where I didn't have access to it for like a good 5, 6 years.
mm,
And even like when the pandemic happened, when I did get access to it, I was like, I want to share it with people. It's just not the same, just eating it by yourself, right?
mhm, mhm.
But I'm lucky enough and to have an amazing Inuit community here. There's an organization here called Tunga Inuit, and every Wednesday they provide me with country food. And when I was pregnant last year, they also came through for me, which was amazing. But yeah, in terms of like those early memories, those are everything to me. Like, those are every Wednesday when I get my country food and I eat it, I think of like my grandfather. I think of my Atatsiak and my Anansiak, and just those memories that, are one of a kind. And I think that's like the one way that I'm able to remember them. And sometimes I'll just like close my eyes and eat it, and I'll just think about those memories that I have with them.
Ah, that's so, my heart is so full right now, honestly. And as you're sharing it, that was so vivid. Like I could literally imagine your grandmother doing all these things and sharing it with you and your siblings and your family. Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. And it really makes me think more about this disconnection that young people have young people who are part of a diaspora or part of communities that they're no longer connected with. There's this longing for belonging and connection. And I think that's really special that you got the opportunity as a young person to grow up in your community and be connected to land. And I really want to ask you, like, how has that impacted you now as an adult, having those early memories with food and your family, but specifically on lands? And reason I ask this is because I'm curious as to how that kind of plays a role or informs how you'll teach this to your son, Kari, who is very young, as I imagine. And what are some of those lessons or takeaways that you want to sort of instill with him,
Yeah.
if there's any?
I think those early memories that I have of hunting with my grandparents and being able to see where my food comes from, and just like the richness of knowing where your food comes from and the process of being able to like harvest your own food,
Mm,
it really. So when we used to hunt, my Datsik was very clear, very, very clear. You never take more than what you need. Don't be greedy. Like that was
Mm.
always something that he instilled in me. And so that's something that I always think about. Like, don't be greedy. Also sharing, like, just like what seem like very small, like basic, I guess, principles,
Mhm.
but they're really not, because if you don't have, I feel like, a foundation for, what does it mean to share and to provide for your community and provide for your family? What does it mean to only take what you need and not to, I guess, over harvest? And like the gluttony that comes, I guess you can always almost put it back to the gluttony that comes in this world where we're just overproducing and just, it's just, we need this, we need that. It's just the consumer culture.
Yeah.
It's just, it's disgusting. And I didn't grow up with that. And I'm so fortunate to have my grandparents who instilled some of those values in me through food. But at the same time, I did live in Toronto. I do live in Ottawa. Like, so I do sometimes participate in consumer culture, but because I had those experiences, they always bring me back to like ground zero, and they always, it's humbling. It's extremely humbling. And so now that I have my son, I thought a lot about these things because it's my son is like black presenting, and he's going to be seen in the world as a black boy, right?
Mhm.
And so I think about that, like what is that going to look like for him? But he's going to grow up like with his mom who's Inuk, and also his grandmother, my Nantuk, who's Inuk. And how do I teach him some of these values without being able to give him the experiences of going up north? Because it's not cheap to be able to go up north, one. And two, it's like hunting and harvesting is also not cheap. I actually, this summer, I'm going to sign up for a little, I feel like it's a step. It's like a little plot of land where you can go and like harvest your own vegetables and your own food.
Mm.
And so it looks different being in the South and doing that, but I still want him to get a sense of, this is what it means to like harvest food. This is how long it takes, like so that he understands the connection to his food. And I also, when I was pregnant with him, I ate a lot of country food, and my auntie told me to do that because if I don't, she said he won't like it.
Mm.
And so whenever I'm here and I have country food, I give it to him. I let him try it. So I let him try like which would be frozen caribou, quack is what we call it,
Mm.
and he loves it. He loves it all. And I actually made him a little because I just got a sewing machine. I made him like a little felt ulu, and I have a
Oh.
little piece of sealskin that I just put on his little play area, and I let him play with that. So yeah, living in the South, and also the complications that are going to come up with his background and how he comes into that as he gets older. I want to make sure I at least, can provide him with some sense of where I came from and some sense of where he comes from in the best way that I can. And I have to be really creative with it. I have to be really inventive, but I really try my best because, I mean, I'm not sure what it looks like to provide these values to him without being connected and physically on our land, and
Mhm.
without having to, or without having the experiences of hunting and the experiences of language and what I grew up with. So this is something I think about on a daily basis, and it's going to be ever evolving and ever changing, I think, really.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's so real. And I I'm a firm believer that food is a vehicle for change, like really and truly, and it connects us to past, present, future, ancestry, land, like all this stuff. So I really think Kari's in good hands, and I'm sure he'll grow up with some really beautiful values.
Thank you.
So, I before we jump into these last few questions around food, I kind of just want to back up again and hear more about your work at the Canadian Roots Exchange, and maybe just share a little bit about the programming that happens there, because I believe it's centered on Indigenous youth. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. So I started the job in 2019, and I originally started as a training and development manager for the what was called the Youth and Reconciliation Initiative. And so what I did there, and what I was supposed to be doing, is I was supposed to be going into our programs and kind of auditing them and creating workshops and whatever needed for the youth and for our employees. But what I actually ended up doing was managing one of the youth reconciliation initiative teams. So I had at the time, I think it was 5 coordinators, super amazing people. And what our program did is we provided youth with the tools to be able to put on community workshops or community programs and whatever reconciliation looked like to them. So, for instance, if we had a group of 5 youth from Iqaluit Nunatsiavut and they wanted to put on a sewing workshop because that's what reconciliation looks like to them.
Mm,
For instance, reconciliation looks like teaching Inuit youth how to sew and therefore to how to be connected to our traditional values, our traditional ways. We would provide them with the funding to buy the materials. We would provide them with workshops on how to create communications, how to create a community event. And so it was really amazing because we actually, before the pandemic hit, got to bring all these youth together from all across Canada. And we got to teach them these skills, and then they would go back to their communities and we would watch them from afar put on these events. It was really amazing to be able to watch that. And so what I did is I helped with some of the workshops. I oversaw the coordinator team to make sure that we were giving the youth these tools that they needed. I was creating some internal programming as well for our team. And I was supposed to be again the pandemic hit, but we were going to be putting on another cohort, and we were supposed to be going all over Inuit Nunagat because we really wanted to focus on Inuit communities. And then the pandemic hit and it kind of all got shut down. Our program was very much so based on youth meeting and youth being connected with one another. And so we really had to rethink what that looked like once the pandemic hit for a multitude of reasons. I mean, if you're trying to reach youth up north, chances are the Wi-Fi is not always going to be the best.
mm,
So the pandemic hit, and then the program actually ended up being dissolved, and I went on maternity leave. So that was like the first little leg in my employment with Canadian Roots Exchange. And then when I came back, which was only a month ago, I've only been back for a month now. I went back when my son was 10 months old. Now I actually work as a manager for the policy school. And so what the policy school does is we have a few programs and we put on workshops and we do virtual learning for youth to learn what policy is and how they can transfer their need for change for as individuals and their communities into policy and like what that looks like.
mm.
And so that's I just started that job now about a month ago, and one of the things I'm going to be focusing on is doing more Inuit engagement and creating more Inuit workshops, Inuit specific workshops, because we really tried to stay away from like the pan-indigenous view that happens.
Mm.
So obviously, not all policy applies to Inuit the same way that it will apply to First Nations communities. And so that's something I'm going to start taking the lead on as the months go by, is really developing that policy school for Inuit youth. And yeah, so that's what I'm doing right now. It's still pretty early, just because I just got back, new role, new position, really trying to transition into that. But I'm hoping that some really amazing things come out of it. And now that things are easing up a little bit with COVID, we're hoping to be able to do more in-person activities because nothing compares to, being in person and seeing each other. Actually, one of the amazing things I got to do, I think it was like a month or two before the pandemic hit, was CRA put on a national gathering in Montreal. And I coordinated having an Inuit room with country food, and I shipped in like 3 whole caribous. And
Wow.
like I think it was like 20 pounds of like mutt duck, and also I brought in char, and so I got to share that. I think at the gathering we had close to like 500-600 people, so I got
Mm.
to share that with a lot of people and share some, I guess, some teachings around that and some stories, and that was an amazing experience. And I think that before the pandemic hit, I went out with a bang before we all got shut down.
Of course, there's no other way to do it.
Yeah.
I That's amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. It's always an incredible feeling to be able to share food with people. And
Hmm.
back to what we've been talking about this whole time, like there's so much power in that. And it's yeah, it's incredible. Also, Yeah, that's really dope work that you're doing at CRE. I'm happy to hear that, and I hope that the that programming and the policy pieces that you're working on develop and become what you imagine them to be.
Yeah, thank you.
So, on this last few questions around food, you know, as we see in food security work, there's often very, despite the very different experiences of displacement of Indigenous folks and Black folks, we often find ourselves today in similar circumstances, experiencing the highest rates of poverty and food insecurity across so called Canada. So, I guess my question here to you, and thinking about the youth engagement that you've done in your past and currently and presently, perhaps like what else do you think we could do together and what could it look like? So in your experience and beyonds, what innovative models are you seeing folks take to come together around the things that we do share or ideas that you might have that are maybe so out there but you don't mind sharing them with me and the rest of the listeners here?
I think that one of my dreams actually is to I'm really thinking abstractly here, but it's something that I've always thought of. I would love to create like a program for Black and Indigenous youth, like a land-based program where
Mm,
we could like bring Black and Indigenous youth, for instance, to, I don't know, Nunavut or Nunavik and do some hunting together, or bring Black and Indigenous youth to whatever Black diaspora homeland that looks like, and kind of get some teachings through that. I think that would be so amazing. Super expensive, and but
the money's there.
I've
The
definitely
money is there.
I've definitely thought about that before, because I think there's only so much that workshops and online learning can do. I think that the best way for us to learn is to be together
Mm,
and to experience things together. I think that's when you really start to see humans for who they are, and you really you connect with people when you spend actual time. I don't think that the online learning piece can really do that. And I think that the workshop piece is valuable in terms of education, but I don't think it has a lot of longevity.
mm.
And I think that spending time with people, you never forget that, right? Like my grandmother always says to me, my Guyanese one, that people don't forget how you made them feel. And so I always think that that would be so amazing. I would love to do that. But again, like just in terms of resources and access and the pandemic, it's really, I think, made things hard,
Hmm.
especially for our communities who are so used to being together.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something that I dream of. I'm not sure if it'll ever happen, but I'm definitely, trying to take the steps to get there. Like you said earlier, like I have my own little consultation business where I do some of these workshops, and I'm creating some right now for Black and Indigenous solidarity and creating space for these conversations.
Mm.
So I'm hoping that eventually one day I can get to a point where I can create some of these, amazing programs and give youth access to get back on their lands and to learn with one another.
Yeah, no, well, that's what dreaming's all about,
Yeah.
right? Is like imagining these things that we don't think are possible, but somehow, sometime they could be.
Yeah.
And, you know, not to get all deep and spiritual on this pod here, but I am a good believer in like manifesting things and speaking them out. And I also feel like there is more than enough resources around this world to make these things happen. It's just a matter of change and having the right people in the right places and power and
Mhm.
all these fun things that we didn't get to talk on, but yeah, dreaming is real and I appreciate you sharing your with us here. And the world is our classroom, right?
Exactly.
Like yeah, I don't think there's nothing as valuable as that. And
Yep.
I'm also so over Zoom. I think Zoom fatigue is real. People are tired of online stuff, so yeah, nothing beats the real deal.
Exactly. And I don't think it always has to be so abstract. Like one thing that I think that when we think about change, sometimes we're like, oh, I have these big ideas, but it could really be so simple. Just for instance, like my Anansiak hasn't met my son yet.
Mm,
And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do is to me and my Anansiak want to go back to our home community and where my Adatsia grew up, and we want to spread his ashes there. And I would love to bring my son back to where I came from. I feel like
mm,
it's, like that gathering and that coming together as communities doesn't just need to happen on an external level. I feel like within our communities and within our families that can happen as well. And so that's something that I'm like saving up for right now. I'm hoping to be able to go in the spring, and I think that that's like huge. It's really bringing like that's like three generations, right?
Yeah.
Of 3 generations back to where we came from. I also do really small things too, like in my son's room, I have this little place where I've taken pictures of my Anansiak, my great great Anansiak, my great Anansiak, and I put them up so that he can see where he comes from and he can see who he belongs to.
Hmm.
So just I think little things like that, we don't always have to do the external work with, engaging stakeholders and all that extra stuff. Sometimes we can really just make the change within our own families and reconnect, within our own families. My Anansiak, she went to residential school. And so I think
Mm.
that meeting my son and being able to spend time with him is going to be like so healing. It also, I feel like in a way too, like bridges gaps between indigenous and black communities. Like we're one family. Like it doesn't get more. I don't think it gets any better than that.
Preach. Preach to that. Yeah, I think that is such an important takeaway. And yeah, just something to really sit with is that change doesn't have to be this macro thing. As you say, it doesn't need to be this dreadful systems approach, as it can be like that, and it's important to do that work, but also the micro things matter too, and like those little changes in your life.
Mhm.
So wow, thank you so much, Jaelyn, for this conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, including that there's an Inuit word for black and Portuguese person. That is so funny, being black and in Portuguese myself. So I got to take that into my daily life and just explore that a little bit more. But I'm also really hopeful about what we can accomplish together. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
That is it for this episode. You can find and reach Jaelyn on Instagram. Jaelyn, do you want to say your Instagram?
Yep, my Instagram is Jaelyn Nakaya, which is one N, so that's JaelyNEkayah.
Excellent. And you can also find her at the Canadian Roots Exchange at canadianroots.ca. Dignity and Joy is a podcast from FoodShare Toronto. We are a food justice organization advocating for the right to food and working to challenge the systemic barriers that keep people from accessing the food that they need to thrive. You can learn more about FoodShare and the work that we do at foodshare.net. And if you have feedback on the pod, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at info@foodshare.net or on our social media. We're at FoodShareTO on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and on Instagram. Dignity and Joy is produced in collaboration with Lead Podcasting with sound engineering and editing by Michael Allen. The production team at FoodShare is Renee D'Souza, Mo Pramanik, and Andrea Thompson. Special thanks to Amanda Cupido, Ashley Marshall, Sharday Phipps Walker, and Shanice Steele. Thank you so much for listening.